It was always strange to me that the conversation of parasocial relationships, a parasocial relationship being a one-sided bond where one person extends emotional energy, interest, or affection toward another party who is unaware of their existence, just was about relationships with modern-day popular figures, when what's been left unsaid is the just as parasocial nature we have towards historical figures. A historical figure like, say, Napoleon or Julius Caesar is often treated as more than just a person, but more like an archetype or concept shaped by media representations and stories. Their outline culturally and our subconscious perception of them throughout history is often shaped by little anecdotes by historians of their time, famous artwork depicting them at their most iconic moments, and the grand statues that are looming above us in iconic historical places in the world. And most of us, despite never meeting them, have these grand iconic images in our minds, feel like through them we understand or have a little bit of understanding of who they were. That sort of connection doesn't really get analysed in the same way as our treatment toward modern-day celebrities or politicians because 1. This is how we've always culturally treated them for centuries, and 2. When talking about parasociality, most of the analysis is usually about the exploitative nature of it, how modern-day celebrities profit off of how people feel connected to them, how it breeds loneliness and prevents people from making actual connections because they can always retreat into the comfort of their imagined connection. But obviously with historical figures, there isn't an actual expectancy of a relationship because they've been passed away for centuries. It doesn't feel as weird as a connection because there's no actual relationship and no chance of exploitation. But at the same time, that general idea, an interest or affection toward another party who is unaware of their existence, that's what studies of historical figures is really, a form of parasociality, just a different flavor of it. And from this revelation, I extrapolated 2 things. 1, that some historians that center around studying a person's life are essentially stands if you think about it long enough. And 2, the shadow of all their statues and almost mythological status is the very swept under the rug humanity of their figures. It's the unattractive, unentertaining sides in their dramas. It's the everyday moments. It's everything that wasn't recorded. It's everything the statues aren't. Culturally, we perceive them in a way that's not quite reality, but not quite fiction either, because it's almost a caricature or exaggerated personality and framing of who they were based on certain moments. And culturally, they become these moments rather than the sum total of who they actually were. Autobiographical movies are a great example of this. While the general outline of their life is usually accurate, the conversations, gravitas of events, and increased importance on certain moments and people are usually incredibly exaggerated. It's often made-up drama about reality to make you sympathize with a popular figure. And also pretty much every major autobiographical movie, especially around musicians, has the exact same plotline. It sells a dream, rather than the reality of their story, and then that interpretation of their story becomes the story. The actor's portrayal can even become the face of who this person is in the public eye, more than the actual person. Like for example, people aren't even thinking of Robert Oppenheimer, they're thinking of Cillian Murphy's portrayal of Oppenheimer. I'm sure there's some young people who don't listen to Elvis, and when they think of Elvis, they think of Austin Butler's portrayal of Elvis rather than the king himself. Growing up in the education system, there was a big emphasis on primary sources and citing from the source, which works brilliantly in an essay in the context of a teacher or professor scrupulously looking at my writing for sources and accuracy. But the conversations we have about culture, and in our own subconscious connotations about culture, usually doesn't meet the same under the magnifying glass type of analysis. Which I think if it did would reveal the fact that culturally, our perception of a lot of history isn't actually coming from sources, it's coming from depictions and portrayals of those sources. Through the portrayals, the conversation gets warped in a really weird way, but people don't talk about it as much. And it doesn't have to be specifically people this happens to. Take any movie set in Egypt, you usually hear a motif like this. That's the Egyptian sound, right? Except it sounds nothing like Egyptian music. Real Egyptian music sounds like this. What happened was, in the silent era of the 1920s, live music often accompanied showings of silent films, and Western composers looked at the setting of the scenes they were composing and tried to match the score to the setting's vibe, mysterious, grand, and exotic, and slowly that, over time, became Egyptian sound rather than the actual instruments or music. Hollywood built this mysticism from the setting that slowly molded itself into the public subconscious of the sound of Egypt. And now, despite there being no real Egyptian music that sounded like this, it's now the sound of Egypt. It may seem like a minor issue, but imagine if people said this is what 1920s New York sounded like. Or this is what 2020's music sounded like. And for a more personal example, right? I'm Australian, and a lot of different countries have this classic Australian catchphrase in their minds of, put a shrimp on the barbie. Thing is, I've never said that. Nobody I know has ever said that. Australians don't say that. We don't even use the word shrimp. We call them prawns. So what happened here was, in the 1980s, there was this incredibly successful run of tourism ads where this guy, Paul Hogan, was saying a bunch of things to appeal to different audiences, most notably Americans, to get them to come travel and check out Australia. And to appeal to an American audience, the word shrimp was used in the slogan since it was more recognizable to them rather than prawns. And now because the ad was so successful, people associate shrimp with Australian lexicon, when it's ironically the opposite, tied to and trying to appeal to American culture. And going back to an historical example, when people think of dinosaurs, the texture of their skin is almost lizard-like, scaly and rough, giant reptiles with thick, leathery hides. This look was mainly popularized by Jurassic Park and movies of the 90s era, but quite a few of the dinosaurs don't actually look like that stereotypical lizard skin look. Now, to be fair to Jurassic Park and movies of that era, that was the wider consensus of the time. The new consensus that theropods had feathers came in 2007, when quill knobs were found in velociraptor remains. And obviously, I don't think they should be blamed for not knowing future discoveries. There are some dinosaurs that in reality had that predominantly scaly look, most notably the Triceratops and Brachiosaurus. But with that said, there was a lot of artistic liberty which they knew was wrong. The Dilophosaurus, which shoots out poison, in reality did not have the ability to shoot out poison. It didn't have any poison or venom. Completely made up form of attack, it doesn't even have frills. The Velociraptor looks almost completely different from its reality. In reality, they were like the size of a turkey, 2 feet tall rather than the size of a 6 foot tall bison or bear. And we've known their height long before the film came out, so they purposely made it more scary for drama's sake. And really sadly, like a few months after Jurassic Park came out, they discovered the Utah Raptor, which actually looks much closer to the Jurassic Park version in height. You'll never guess where the Utah Raptor was found. But the interesting thing is, personally, even though I know the Velociraptor looks like this, when I hear the word Velociraptor, I think of this. I researched and was interested in the Manhattan Project long before Oppenheimer came out. Like most people, that one interview where he says,
"Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
It gripped me. It's like one of the most haunting sentences I've ever heard. He also, like Caesar, shares my first name. But after that movie, whenever I hear about Oppenheimer, I think of the Nolan film. I think of the depiction rather than the reality and actual man I have records and access to videos of. And until I start seeing movies that represent the actual reality, my brain will probably always default to thinking of the pop culture depictions of them. And this probably seems like a trivial issue or problem, but imagine if your entire life or existence was a miscategorization or artistic interpretation that feels like a shallow or hollow version of the actual thing. People would understand you through the lenses of others, an image drawn from fleeting glimpses, popular interpretations, or artistic license. The real you, your full humanity, would be left out, hidden under myth and assumption. Your entire life was edited, dramatized, and made easier for others to digest and understand. Moving past depictions, similar to how over time the theming of Egyptian music became Western interpretations of the vibe of depictions of Egypt, we also build associations with things that don't inherently have those associations. For example, we associate the xylophone's tone with childhood and infancy, even though the xylophone has nothing to do with childhood. It's just we've heard it so much that we now have an association with it. Around the 1930s, xylophones and glockenspiels began being often used in jingles and children's cartoons, most likely due to their simple, high-pitched, cheerful sound. Additionally, as mass-produced toys became more popular during the 20th century, toy versions of xylophones and glockenspiels were introduced, cementing even further their association with childhood. And over time, as it became more used in children's media, it just became an accepted part of commercialized childhood. Now, unlike the others, I do think this is a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Whether the xylophone was used because its tone naturally fits infancy, or because it now fits because we're conditioned to think it does. Maybe there's an alternate universe where it's associated with horror. My first point in all of this is that repetition in media warps reality. People accept a xylophone as a baby-like sound musically even though there's no inherent connection, much like how film shaped the image of dinosaurs or the sound of Egypt.
Or the precedent that Australians are having shrimps on Barbies.
So that's a cool little fun observation, but why am I making such a big fuss over it? I was talking to a friend after my Gen Z video dropped, and she said something really striking to me. I look back at my old Instagram stories, I see those pictures as if they're my memories, but the way I actually experienced those moments was completely different from how I remember them through the photos. Her actual memories didn't match the way those photos were captured. Even though the photo shows a real point in time, it's not really reality because it's carefully selected. The angle, the lighting, and the subconscious awareness of I'm being filmed right now doesn't truly reflect what our experience was like. What's wild is that when I look at old photos, my memories change to fit what's in the picture. It creates a sense of nostalgia for a perfect version of the past that never really existed. Now, whenever I go places, I find myself trying to recreate the same idealized version of reality through my phone because real life doesn't seem to live up to the expectations I built for it. Her memories of her lived experience is entirely different to the captured essence of them. While it is a captured photo of a moment in time, it's cherry-picked and makes it an unauthentic way to truly capture what her experience was like. The awareness of a camera or that other people are going to view you in that moment changes that moment. These moments become a polished, idealized form that doesn't reflect the chaotic, imperfect reality we actually inhabit. Think of editing a photo after you take it, or how in group photos everyone stops what they're doing, smiles, and stares blankly at the camera. Or even portrait paintings, where painters get the subjects to do a certain expression or pose in a certain way. Point being, our tools to showcase or communicate our lived experience is almost always, even in a tiny way, a misrepresentation of actual reality. And because of how our memories play tricks on us by romanticizing or demonizing the past, making it something it isn't, we aren't even reliable narrators of ourselves truly. This leads me to one of the philosophical concepts I hate the most, which is the idea of the authentic self. The authentic self is this idea of a person's true nature or identity, free from external influences, social conditioning, and pretense. It's the notion of who someone really is when they're not performing for others or trying to conform to societal expectations. And I guess it's more so I hate the conversation around the idea rather than the idea itself. Because if you think about it deep enough, you realize we pretty much never act authentically, communicate authentically, or are our authentic selves. Socialization changes everything about how we act because it teaches us how to act, and any socialized person doesn't communicate in a truly unfiltered way. Personally, how I perceive and communicate reality is filtered through the English language. That's inherently not authentic. I'm not joking. We've both likely been conditioned to view it as natural, but it isn't. It's just ingrained into me. When I'm feeling hunger, I have the feeling my body may grumble in its stomach, but subconsciously I'm thinking through the English language, I'm really hungry right now, it's time to feast. In this very script, I'm editing in my own subconscious what words will communicate this idea the most effectively, and what won't under the overarching idea of how can I most pinpointedly describe my idea. And by selectively choosing what to say, even for clarity's sake for you, the viewer, it's not authentic. In prayer, when praying to God in isolation, you're speaking to God and choosing what you say depending on your relationship to Him.
And
there's a really strange phenomenon when people write in journals their experiences, day-to-day life, dreams, and longings. They're usually writing to themselves, and yet they are still writing with the knowledge that someone will view this, even if it's just themselves. And psychologists have observed they will still write like they're talking to someone. Even in private moments, we are, in a sense, performing, interpreting reality and communicating it through filters and mediation. Being perceived, even by ourselves, means we are performing. So that begs the question, what is the unmediated form of human expression? Well, crying is probably the most unfiltered form of expression, as is most of our unconscious facial expressions. Smiling, laughing, frowning. When we cry, we often try and hide it because of how authentic it is. It only emphasizes its authenticity in the fact that we try and hide it. In a world where so much of our interaction is mediated through language, media, or even the deliberate curation of our identities, crying stands out as a moment where everything around expression fades away, and what's left is the unfiltered truth of our emotional state. It's the naked emotion, without the layers of clothes that is words and metaphors, and the, yeah man, I'm doing fine, that is most of our responses. Crying as an act is, perceive me, in all of my vulnerabilities. Which is why it can be almost violating to let others see that, or like you're putting a burden on them, and also why it can feel so comforting. When seen, you are perceiving me at my most vulnerable in my utmost sincerity, and I'm letting you see that. But crying and laughing is more of an instinctual response than an intentional form of communication. If we're sticking solely with language, there's a certain creature in the animal kingdom that I think embodies authenticity in messaging, quite literally. Octopuses communicate not through a system of symbolic language like humans, but by directly transforming their physical appearance, changing color, texture, and shape in real time to convey messages. In a sense, octopuses bypass the limitations of language altogether. Where human communication can misrepresent or obscure meaning, octopuses use their bodies as a direct reflection of their internal state. It's an immediate and visceral form of expression, which might feel more truthful or direct because it doesn't rely on the imperfect symbols of language. They literally become the messages they're trying to express, like an ultimate authentic transformation between experience and expression. However, I don't think authenticity in communication is the goal. It's the message itself. Sure, octopuses are more authentic in presenting their communication, but does authenticity matter when it hinders the potential of depth? Life is more than just the simple experience of living and showcasing that. It's what consciousness thinks of itself and its living. If your only form of expression is immediate reactions, you're ironically not being authentic, because life is more than just the immediacy of reaction. It's ironically more authentic to use abstract language when describing such abstract feelings like jealousy, or grief, or longing. It's the connotations we have of our connotations. It's the interpretation of that immediate interpretation. Can an octopus write Requiem by Mozart, auditorily conveying the profound sense of loss in his own mortality and the mortality of those around him? It may not be authentic, it may be grandiose, it's not a spontaneous expression of grief or mortality, quite the opposite. It's a carefully composed work, filled with layers of symbolism, history and artistic complexity, that had so many rewrites, edits and days of mulling over. Mozart died while writing it, Franz Xavier Susamary had to take over to publish and complete it. But I'd say despite it lacking an unmediated, unfiltered rawness, it still feels profound, and its own way feels authentic, much more than changing shape and color or speaking alone ever could. That abstraction and complexity is a more authentic way to show such a complex and abstract but still very real threat that is mortality. So it's whether the description fits what's being perceived and described and accurately conveys its outline. Because language is not truth and will never be truth. It is a description of truth. No matter how carefully we choose our words, or vice versa, how raw and unfiltered we express our expressions, they will always fall short of conveying the full depth of our experiences or the reality we're trying to express. Why am I mentioning this? Because in history, people have used both of those ideas. Repetition becomes the public's subconscious understanding of reality, and language and perception can never truly capture truth to make a statue out of their figure that will outlive their lived body. They have exploited language's weakness to, in a sense, create a fictionalized version of reality, which when repeated, becomes socially accepted as the true reality. This leads us to the process and idea of creating context. Previously, I've talked about how an algorithm individually socializes you through media. This is usually an unintentional side effect to do with maximizing engagement through ads. Apps want you to spend more and more time on them so you see more and more ads. Creators, companies, and businesses then compete for your attention, which really is a lose-lose for everyone. Everything is becoming optimized. And as a consequence, it begins to feel artificial and similar because instead of making an editing choice for storytelling or artistic reasons, it's for the attention economy and the algorithm. Creators begin making their videos as formulaic as possible to optimize their output. With companies, rather than really show off their product's potential, it becomes about association and jingles, and sticking in the head of the viewer through whatever means necessary. The brand begins being more important than the product. Instead of the algorithm serving the videos begin serving the algorithm, etc. And as a side effect, everyone feels like they can't focus anymore, because real life does not spoon feed you with intentional cuts, music in the background, and subtitles over everything you say. It's a much more mundane, but meaningful experience. This video is about a more intentional socialization. It's about how leaders, politicians, and historical figures have changed what is perceived as reality to benefit them or their pursuits, and how it, in a very strange way, absolutely relates to the everyday man today. I want to start off by saying that creating context, really, is about showing a tailored set of events and creating a tailored reaction in the audience viewing it. Create context for how people perceive reality or truth, and how they interact with that in their life, and with the self-awareness that you're doing so. It is a decision for the perception of another. Like if you were to say to someone that there's a train coming at 2:30, let's catch it, and it turns out the train was actually at 2:40, you were just wrong about timing. You weren't trying to change how someone perceives the world or its people. Creating context is a deliberate action. This isn't about outright deception, but rather choosing what to highlight and what to omit. In doing so, the creator of the context subtly influences how the audience processes the information and how they feel about it. It's a form of manipulation, but often invisible, because the audience may not even realize that their perspective is being shaped in this way. This doesn't have to be a mind-altering choice. It can be something very small. Starting with a small example, Joseph Stalin's name isn't actually Joseph Stalin. He adopted Stalin as a pseudonym because in Russian, Stalin roughly translates to man of steel. This is a very micro example, but it's a good idea of what I mean by creating context. How many people know he did that? If everyone writes his name as Joseph Stalin, in most of education, if they refer to him as Stalin, his propaganda lives beyond him and becomes a part of him. Even those criticizing him will reference him as Stalin. They're unconsciously reinforcing the persona he constructed. They're, in a small way, promoting the image he wanted them to see. By controlling the narrative, even through something as simple as a name, he shaped how future generations perceive him. I'm giving into that propaganda right now, mainly because his real name is really hard to pronounce. To move on to a more macro example, sticking with Stalin again. When he was on the rise and Trotsky was his main opposition, he would do public trials of his political enemies. His secret police, the NKVD, would arrest and detain said opposition, often using brutal methods to extract forced confessions. They would confess to unreal crimes out of fear of their family being put in harm's way, or being promised survival. These confessions, no matter how unbelievable or blatantly false, were used as evidence in carefully staged show trials that were meant to both humiliate Stalin's rivals and validate his authority. You'll notice he didn't just eliminate his opponents. His idea was, I won't silence you, not yet. You will become a mouthpiece for my ideas. You will become a living example of my descriptions of truth. You will become the descriptions I do of my enemies. You will reinforce my truth until it becomes the truth. Rather than simply censoring content or going for the throat immediately, the idea is to curate it, squeezing the throat for you until it provides a coherent, structured version of reality that supports his version of the truth. Your enemies at their ends will become your biggest allies. And for a more modern day example, YouTube as a platform is a more subtle but still deliberate form of curation. And this time I'm not talking about the algorithm, I'm talking about the guidelines. There are certain topics I can't talk about or else I'll get a disclaimer under this video, and there are other words I can't talk about or it won't get promoted. Which, when trying to describe real tragic events, is very hard. I have to use creative wordplay when I should just plainly state the reality of a situation. I'm trying to describe the reality while downplaying its brutality, which I understand is a sadly necessary formality, but I feel in turn my art loses its potential originality. Bars. Literally. This has had a trickle-down effect where I saw people in real life using algorithmic speak. Those guidelines had an effect on the creators, which then had an effect on the audience that watched them, aka my generation. A really awful thing I saw when I was younger was someone trying to take their own life, and sadly was done very publicly. And people tried to recap the situation hours later to people who hadn't seen it, and when they recapped the situation they said, "Oh, he tried to unalive himself." People still end up talking about controversial subjects, of course, but they end up talking about it without the impact or punch of using emotive language or even the plain language of what happened. It's a neutered form of commentary that benefits no one and prevents serious topics from having necessary serious conversations. If we ever get out of this will be remembered as the dark ages of commentary, this blip in the system where everyone started speaking like a fucking baby. It reminds me of like the silver age of comic books where anything that wasn't explicitly squeaky clean wasn't allowed. And as an example of a much needed conversation that can't be properly discussed, mental health is a perfect example.
I'm pretty sure everyone is aware of mental health. I don't know anyone who isn't.
There's this weird contradiction in the time I'm living in where everyone agrees we are living in a mental health crisis, but also says there is always help available. Well, if the help was good, we wouldn't be living in a mental health crisis now, would we? It's this corporate awareness of, hey, a lot of people are struggling right now, and saying we really need to start treating other people's feelings seriously and having conversations about it, when you ironically can't talk about why we have people struggling mentally, because to do so you need to use language that describes the brutal nature of life, not a sanitized version so a mobile game ad can play. The actual impact of what this is doing to people, the amount of people whose entire lives are filled with a quiet despair, and no one's speaking for them and they lose the light in them and then they become another number in a growing statistic, and you can't even say the word of the statistic. You just have to say, again, unalive. Moving to a personal example, I am sowing the seeds for my legacy in the subconscious minds of those who perceive me right now. It's everything I'm not saying, it's everything I am saying. I am creating context. Every line I write is creating the impression that will live on beyond me. There's a big difference between me, Julius the person, and this YouTube channel. And the presentation I'm doing of myself is just that, a presentation. So this leaves us with the question of motivation. Why would somebody want to curate reality, curate perception? For me, it's so I can present my idea as cleanly and neatly as possible. I would do a stream of consciousness thing for authenticity, but it actually works with the idea I'm saying that I consider every minute detail of this. Even this fake little weird chuckle thing I'm doing right now was planned in advance in the script so I can get you to think about how much of the things you watch online are planned in advance and are a performance. The more obviously fake I make this, funnily enough, the more obviously it puts the spotlight on my point. For YouTube, it's advertisers. If they downright censored these words and topics, there would be a riot and people in the streets. But because they softly censor it, they instead get begrudging compliance. People might mumble about unfairness under their breath when they get demonetized every now and then, but still at a basic level, YouTube achieves their goals and there isn't ever an actual disruption that would meaningfully change their status quo. It's an accepted reality. Even though YouTube at one point allowed such topics to be discussed and allowed such language, they squeezed creators until they all followed the same rules and talked for them.
And YouTube's hollow landscape of AI thumbnails, intellectual popcorn, and Hiroshima levels of fakeness to the point where selling out and turning everything interesting about yourself into a cardboard cutout brand isn't even an insult anymore, it's the goal, is the monument that sits atop their victory. Why does Stalin want his enemies speaking for him? Because it's so much more believable when your enemies speak for you. Pretty self-explanatory. But I want to focus on the conscious choice part of this, which is the performance for the audience as they're curating their reality. The awareness of an audience is thought of long before the action occurs and the audience is seeing it. Stalin's entire motivation was the audience, the perception, every move from thought to talk to rallying his secret police to do this deplorable act, the secrecy, the covering it all up. His main goal was to not just take out his enemies, it was to have his enemies take themselves out while letting the public watch. YouTube's was we are going to get blowback regardless from the general public by beginning deplatforming controversial creators and demonetizing that which we view as unadvertiser friendly. So their challenge was managing public relations in a way that accepts they are going to get blowback, but minimizing the blowback as momentary. It becomes normal that a platform for broadcasting yourself has a filter in doing such. And I think of all of you while writing all of these. Am I boring you right now? How can I thread the needle and make you like my idea? How can I make it flow well? If I boiled down the communication of my idea in a way that's authentic, it would kill its depth. If YouTube plainly said, we don't like edgy content or controversial issues on our platform and began banning it, it would be a PR nightmare. And at that moment around 2017, they might have lost a stranglehold on the market. But because they went for a systematic approach that targeted finances with the demonetization system, they got the almost exact same result without as bad blowback. If Stalin said what he was going to do or didn't make the prisoners confess, he would have been arrested immediately. And him and his false name would have been a side note in history. All three of these examples don't plainly state what their intention is. They let it play out in a curated way that reveals itself as a natural progression of events. A lot of the time it's not what you're saying, what you're doing, it's how you're saying it, how you're doing it. There's this book I read as a kid and it's called The 12 Caesars. It's about the first 11 emperors of Rome and also Julius Caesar because he was never officially called or declared an emperor. It's written by this guy called Suetonius, and while it's not the best for learning about the time itself, it is very interesting insight into some of the personal lives of ancient figures. Whereas other historians of the time would focus on major events like Pompey fleeing Rome, the forming of the first triumvirate, Caesar's first meeting with Cleopatra, Suetonius would talk about Caesar not letting Cleopatra return home without buying her expensive gifts, how he would sleep with so many people he got called every woman's husband and every man's wife, and how Caesar was so self-conscious about his balding, which is the reason he wore his iconic wreath so much. He's been described as a colourful historian. It literally says on the back of the book, one of the most colourful biographical works in history. Essentially meaning Suetonius was really gossipy. But in between all the petty stuff which is kind of interesting, there's some genuinely really insightful stuff here as well. How Caesar would endure the same conditions as his men, he would eat the same food, march alongside them as a form of camaraderie and respect, which built loyalty in his troops. How Caligula declared himself a god and demanded worship, building temples, sacrifices, statues of himself, literally demanding that people would address him as a deity, eventually leading to his demise. And how Augustus, Caesar's nephew, understood the importance of public image and deliberately avoided calling himself king or dictator or god, choosing instead the title princeps or first citizen. This subtle maneuver allowed him to consolidate absolute power without being called out for absolute power or monarchy, which was the main reason the Senate turned against Caesar at the end of his life. Again, a lot of the time it's not what you're saying, what you're doing, it's how you're saying it, how you're doing it. He got the exact same results and level of power by choosing a different title, by maintaining the facade of the Republic in the public eye. So I read this book as a kid about all these insights into historical Roman leaders, and one section always stood out to me, and it's what got me writing the basis of this whole video. After reading up more, I prefer the version from The Life of Julius Caesar by Plutarch, so I'll be reading from that. This is the Suetonius version for those curious. Plutarch is more respected and, in my opinion, a better writer. In like manner, we are told again that, in Spain, when he was at leisure and was reading from the history of Alexander, he was lost in thought for a long time, and then burst into tears. His friends were astonished and asked the reason for his tears. "Do you not think," said he, "it is matter for sorrow that while Alexander, at my age, was already king of so many peoples, I have yet achieved no brilliant success?" In the Suetonius version, the next paragraph he says this: "I don't know what to say." Naturally, as a kid reading this account, the Alexander one, not the one with his mother, it struck a chord because seeing a famous figure that iconic and revered, the man with quotes like, "I came, I saw, I conquered," and "if I fail it is only because I have too much pride and ambition," to have such a human and vulnerable moment, It was strange. It's like a priest telling a dirty joke or something. It was to me as a child an unexpected and humbling reminder that they too were just people. It flat out disagreed with my childish idealism that these people were more than the people around me or myself, that they felt similarly to me, and this thought of historical figures thinking of another historical figure the same way broke that barrier of understanding. The need Caesar had to prove himself, especially in regards to the similar in age Alexander the Great, when seeing a statue and records, a physical embodiment of what he represented, was fascinating, and I think it's tied to this particular need, which is the need to be perceived in a meaningful way that matters to the person. At that point, he was in his own right successful. He had a successful run at politics, being a quaestor, and he'd already begun being in the military, becoming a praetor. He was building a reputation, even earning himself a civic crown sometime in his early 20s. But it was something good on paper and a list of working achievements. Nothing statue-worthy, nothing monumental. The word monumental naturally comes from monument, a physical memorabilia to a person who left such an impact that people carve out material to resemble the person and their essence. And it can be visited and adored and admired and envied, just like Alexander's statue. A legacy that could stand the test of time and be forever revisited. Lasting significance. To etch himself into the collective memory of culture and humanity, be important to it. Legacy is a strange want because it can simultaneously feel like the most important and the least important out of every want. The most because it's the only thing that will stay of us in earthly reality, and the least because, well, at that point I'm dead, so think or don't think whatever you want about me. And the middleman truth I'll alliterate with two quotes. One, at the end of the game, the king and pawn go back in the same box. And secondly, the same worms that eat me will eat you too, which originates, as far as I know, from a Viagra Boys song. They are both describing an inherent truth that no matter what economic standing or social ranking a person finds themselves in, we all meet the same fate in the end. You might have a prettier casket, but it's a casket nonetheless. This is why impact is really so valued, because all material things fade away over time, and all that's left is the imprint a person had, not what they had. Once we realize this, the mentality often switches and becomes, think whatever you want of me, but please, still think of me. That need to feel like I, in a tangible way, actually mattered to reality or the human struggle, knowing that something of myself persists beyond the end. I would say there are a significant number of people whose lifestyle and mindset is solely for that, for their legacy. It's the ultimate psychological comfort. I left a footprint on something much larger than myself, and who I was will live on through its ripple effects. Maybe I can't control death yet, but maybe I can make it so my influence can, in a sense, live on. The Romans understood this importance more than anyone. Your mind is probably jumping to the statues and paintings as the example I'm going to use, but it's actually a rather unique form of punishment they had. Damnatio memoriae was a form of punishment that erased a person's legacy, essentially wiping them from public memory. It, in Latin, translates to condemnation of memory. The individual's name was removed from official inscriptions on buildings, monuments, and public works. Any texts or documents that reference the person would be destroyed, revised, or overwritten. Sculptures, paintings, and other depictions of the individual were also defaced, destroyed, or removed. Citizens would often be discouraged or even punished for even speaking the name of the condemned. Essentially, the public was forced to have a collective amnesia about the subject. Obviously, because of the purposeful erasure of these people's lives, we don't actually know the exact number of people this happened to. How many people were there who were wiped from history, intentionally scrubbed out of the books, an entire life of letters, papers, drawings, statues burned away, or wiped from existence? Memory can be the ultimate weapon, as it can give the ultimate death. There's that classic Hemingway line, "Every man has two deaths, when he is buried in the ground, and the last time someone says his name." In some ways, men can be immortal. If I was to add on to it, I would say that some men can be more dead than others. From being reduced to a memory, to being reduced to nothing. It's important to note that these were not punishments for the common man. You had to have a legacy for the legacy to be destroyed. So these were people who would have already been in power or notable enough to have something to lose. For example, Emperor Geta, who was assassinated by his brother Caracalla. After Geta was secretly executed, Caracalla then ordered the damnatio memoriae on Geta to solidify his own power, erasing his brother and subsequently the event from ever existing in the eyes of the people. Obviously, this wasn't done as clean and orderly as other cases, otherwise we wouldn't know of this as we do now, but it shows how personal and intentionally planned the supposed retribution usually was. In Roman law, they described it as a punishment. But like most laws and punishments, it was really just used for control.
regardless of actual wrongdoing. And it wasn't just limited to the Romans who did this. In Egypt, gods were wiped away because it served rulers to use another god. Dead pharaohs were hidden and erased to make the living pharaoh seem more prevalent, and to not have to share with the dead in the public's admiration. They wiped others' perception to make theirs better. They rewrote history to make it fit with their narrative. They threw others down the ladder and acted like they were never on to begin with, rewriting the past to remain in a never-ending relevance in the minds of the public. Physically, you are what you eat, but intellectually, you are what you read and perceive. The strategy of a person with influence is to make your intellectual or perceptual diet serve or be their propaganda or marketing. Make your perception of the world filtered through theirs. I'll use a modern-day example. The goal of an influencer, much like an advertisement, is to stay a part of the subconscious of the viewer. In the current climate and landscape of digital media, content creators and influencers constantly manufacture drama so that they maintain a certain level of relevance online. On Twitch and other live streaming platforms, it's called clip farming. They intentionally act provocative and say inflammatory statements or act strangely. Then other influential people react to it, then the audience reacts to that reaction, and then discussion forms around it on online forums. It's a self-sustaining cycle of relevance that is completely designed and is a measured trade-off. Because to them, it's better to be annoying and then get 0 viewers on Twitch. And influencers, on a broader scale in particular, constantly do fake drama with no lasting backlash. It's an all publicity is good publicity mindset that works because it's never anything actually illegal or morally unforgivable, but something provocative enough to incite some form of discussion, and the public falls for it. Like every time. Companies as well have recently stopped caring about prestigiousness and have started purposely making controversial statements and advertisements just for attention, so that you're thinking about them. Razer recently did this advertisement on Instagram that literally uses sounding audio and has nothing really to do with the product.
I'm having a hard time getting it in.
It's fine. I mean, this is your first time, isn't it?
Yeah.
That video got 800,000 likes. Razer typically gets 3,000. And everyone making a comment trying to call out how weird it is directly contributed to its success without realizing that they're doing so. And here's a little secret about news and drama channels and people who cover new information. As much as they may complain that they hate this, whatever event or shocking bit of news has happened, the last thing they want is boredom or nothing wrong happening. Their nightmare is a stable world or a stable people. They want discourse, they want people acting outrageous, they want tragedy, they want drama. They act like they don't, or like it's a chore, or like it's annoying, but their bottom line, both in terms of influence and finance, is dependent on misery, outrage, and tragedy. Stability doesn't drive views, chaos does. This creates a perverse incentive to amplify negativity and dysfunction even in the face of progress or peace. Their business model is contingent on conversations being indefinite. They actively want a never-ending spiral they get to commentate on. The world offline is far more stable and nuanced than the digital landscapes would have us believe. Most people you meet are just trying to live their lives and are at least neutral if not kind. If people's understanding of the world and its inhabitants comes from such information sources, you would genuinely think that World War III is tomorrow and your neighbor is the one that started it. This might make you think that it's kind of fucked up that the people who manage information have a financial incentive for the world or groups of people to be in a bad place or to showcase that, but that's a topic for another day. The point I'm making here is that staying in the public subconscious, even in a in-the-moment negative way, is more important to people with influence than being liked. For leaders, it's obvious why they would want such a stranglehold on the narrative, why they would project visions of themselves that weren't true, so they can be in power, so that they can be liked, so they can be perceived at all. But why would the common man care at all about such a thing? He doesn't need votes or widespread social support, he just needs the basic tenets. Well, how many of us would feel like we never lived at all if our impact on others was taken away? If life was just the experience and your impact was null and void, would you actually really feel like you lived in any real way? Is the experience of living in itself the good part or the meaningful part? I don't think so. I don't think the point of being here is just to live. Think about the most common phrase people say with their general ambition in life. Besides live, laugh, love. It's, I want to leave the world a better place than I found it. It's the impact. It's the effect on people. It's the effect on reality. That's the point. It's a stereotypical Tinder bio-ass phrase, but it's a great phrase. I want to leave an impact. I want that impact to be good. An existential ache to be meaningful. To not just be here and then be gone, but be gone and have our absence in life genuinely felt through the echoes of our lived effect. And from that ambition and drive comes a heartily dark realization a person can have. I'm not interesting enough to be wiped from the history books because I'm not in the history books. I will likely never be in the history books. I'm not even a side note. In death, as I was in life, I am by all means existentially irrelevant. To the point where the only remains of me will be files and dates.
I lived at this time, I died at this time, I went to school here, I worked here, banal facts that are completely impersonal. Like a resume of random shit I went through or did, but it doesn't really represent or say anything about me. Carl Jung put it well when he said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself." This inability to communicate effectively the things that are important to us, or living in a way that feels actually meaningful, is a sort of autopilot living, which is when you're alive, but you feel dead because you're not meaningfully impacting reality or meaningfully being seen by someone else. I mean, think of the most common fantasies we have. Becoming a rock star, a famous icon, the hero who saves the day, a billionaire living in luxury, a groundbreaking artist, the genius who changes the world, explorers uncovering hidden treasures, visionaries leading movements, storytellers who shape minds and inspire generations, or even just the person who gets swept away in a whirlwind romance. And obviously, it doesn't have to be this grandiose. It's that feeling of, I want people to notice the gains I got this past month. I want so-and-so to like what I'm wearing. Even sex is just wanting to be wanted. It's not just wanting to be seen, it's the ache of feeling alone in that wanting, as though no one else feels this way. Or if they do, not in the way that you do. The need to be perceived stems from the fear of never being meaningfully seen. It's the realization that, despite our best efforts to matter, most of our lives will ultimately be reduced to these impersonal facts. Gravestones are like the penultimate example of this. You can live an entire life and it will be summed up in a sentence and a select human interpretation of time. And given time, everyone who would really care about that sentence will become the same summation. And then people really wouldn't feel in a meaningful way the generic platitude that likely accompanies it. Because the wife and son who understood the memory and the phrase, "he was a loving father," and truly felt and experienced that, is like the father was, a memory now. Gravestones seem like markers for memories, but as time goes on, they become static markers that someone was here at some point, at some time. A memory becomes an idea of a memory. A person who was loved and loving becomes an idea of a person who was loved and loving. Because everyone who felt that love and gave it is a memory. I'm not here to lament gravestones, really. I'm here to lament people who know exactly their legacy before it's over and feel like their entire life is one long wait for their gravestones. A silent resignation to the impersonal nature of their personal lives. Hans Steininger was a German 16th century man who lived in Austria. He was the mayor of Braunau am Inn back in 1567 and was, by all accounts we know of, well liked. Why am I talking about Hans Steininger? Because he tripped on his own beard and died. Hans grew such a long beard, 4.5 foot long in fact, that he would keep it rolled up in his pocket. That is, along with his successful political career, what he was originally famous for, but not what he would end up being known for. That was his death. So the story goes, on September 28th, 1567, one of the nights as mayor, a fire broke out in his town. While trying to calm the citizens and quell the fire, as all of this commotion was going on, his beard slipped out of his pocket, and later on in the night, while he was likely speaking to the townsfolk on the top of a staircase, he tripped over his own beard, fell all the way down, breaking his neck in the process. And that was the end of Hans Steininger. The citizens afterwards, so enamored with their fallen mayor and feeling saddened by their loss, wanted to do a memorial for him in his service, so they constructed a monument to be at the site of the inn he owned. This is a picture of that statue. They also cut off his beard before he was buried and preserved it with chemicals, preventing decomposition. I was trying to do a synopsis that in some way does justice to the man and his legacy. On Wikipedia, there is one page which is pretty much all about his beard, and every other article is again solely about his beard and death. Trying to find information about his actual lived life is so hard because everything is about his beardly death. There is a museum section which has currently been dedicated to this man's beard, which has been preserved. People come from all walks of life to see it, and his actual body is just normally buried. Can you imagine that? He is a man who's dedicated himself to his town, who served in a position of trust and likely had a multitude of accomplishments, yet all of those efforts are overshadowed by one unfortunate, almost absurd accident. It doesn't really matter what he did in his life or that he was mayor, because he will always be known as the guy who died tripping on his own beard, like a cartoon character slipping on a banana peel. You see this similarly with viral memes sometimes, where people become famous for some tiny funny event, and no matter what they do for the rest of their life, they will likely be known as that event more than 99.9% of other things they do in life. You can live a whole life, but it can be reduced to one moment. And so comes the beginning of the dilemma. We have a need to be perceived, but the limits of language, expression, and perception, and really just the limits of understanding, can be utterly terrifying. We only see people in our moments with them. In my own life, I probably hate someone who doesn't deserve it. I just saw them at their worst, and that became my perception of them. And vice versa, I'm probably loved by someone in a way I don't deserve, and hated by someone in a way I don't deserve. The perception others have of you is, unless a created context, uncontrollable, which hurts because it can feel like your entire character can be misinterpreted by certain moments that become the general understanding of who you are in the eyes of the perceivers. And as we are living in the information age, every bit of information you put out is ammunition that can be used against yourself. Like it would be a bad move strategically to have your face online. This is what I look like, by the way. Previously, I talked about how Gen Z has been socialized to the point where their understanding of reality is coming from media more than real life, and over-socialization. And a side effect of over-socialization, especially the unique one that Gen Z is going through, is truly crippling self-awareness. As in, it's not just awareness of self, it's awareness of self in the eyes of others. Because you see so much, you can begin to predict how people will react to whatever action you could potentially do. You become hyper-attuned to others' responses, almost preemptively navigating their judgments or misunderstandings. And as a response to this crippling self-awareness, this generation in particular has a defense mechanism. The smart move for the average person is to not control context. It's to have no context. As in, there's nothing really for someone to judge or take as the context of who you are. Purposely making yourself unremarkable so you never get a bad remark or ever be misrepresented because there's nothing to represent. It's becoming the equivalent of an empty handshake, removing elements of yourself that are vulnerable or not entirely socially palatable. Calculated blandness, a cardboard cutout personality. I don't like Schopenhauer very much, but he came up with a thought experiment and analogy that describes it perfectly. Just stick with me here. One cold winter's day, a number of porcupines huddled together quite closely in order through their mutual warmth to prevent themselves from being frozen. But they soon felt the effect of their quills on one another, which made them again move apart. Now when the need for warmth once more brought them together, the drawback of the quills was repeated so they were tossed between two evils, until they discovered the proper distance from which they could best tolerate one another. Thus, the need for society, which springs from the emptiness and monotony of men's lives, drives them together, but their many unpleasant and repulsive qualities and insufferable drawbacks once more drive them apart. The mean distance which they finally discover and which enables them to endure being together is politeness and good manners. Or in my analysis, blandness and hiding away. The analogy is trying to parallel the porcupine's need for warmth to our human need for love and being meaningfully seen. Just as the porcupine huddles closer to each other, the more they risk being physically hurt. The more vulnerable we are to others, the more we risk being hurt. This is called the porcupine's dilemma. While Schopenhauer initially framed it around social politeness, it's since in psychoanalysis become a metaphor for the human condition itself and the connection we have towards the treatment of each other. It was also in this little underground show called Evangelion. I would say the principle in of itself isn't actually a negative. Meaningful relationships are built and start out from nothing. They start out from small talk and fake laughing and asking how your day was on Bumble. In most cases, you can't meaningfully talk to someone initially. It just naturally happens as you spend time with them. And it's good to maintain distance at first because 1, some people just don't have your best interests in mind. Bad idea to get close to them. And 2, putting too much onto someone too fast puts them in a very inconvenient position. It's like a preemptive boundary that's agreed upon by people, that it's a bad idea to rush things.
I think I'm in love with you.
You can't love someone unless you know them, so it's a very strange, uncomfortable lie to say that you love them. It devalues love and makes it meaningless if you say it without the context to truly love them. It's charming, I guess, if it was your first real relationship at like 14, 2 weeks into dating them, but really off-putting to see when it's people in their mid to late 20s still doing this, which does happen. And it doesn't just have to be love that this relates to. There's a reason in this generation there's the term trauma dump, where someone just lays out all their trauma and misgivings on someone way too fast or without the right context to do so.
Hi.
Hello, hello, hello.
Nice to meet you.
Hi, I'm Nancy.
Nancy. That's my mom's name.
My dad named me after my great aunt who was a slave.
Okay, I'm sorry. Let's talk about TV.
So I don't have an issue with maintaining distance, especially at first. The problem is approaching every relationship like this, or more importantly, staying like this with every relationship. Never letting anyone see you. Again, Gen Z learned very good defense mechanisms from being hurt. Their language is largely ironic. Their relationships are physically close but emotionally distant. People settle for halfway connections that can be dissolved without consequence because, like the porcupine, we don't want to get hurt. People settle for language and humor that is devoid of vulnerability because you can't get criticized when the language itself is detached from yourself. And situationships are fine, do what you want, and irony is funny and I use it myself. But a lot of people don't have a single meaningful relationship, and it is killing them. The only time they are meaningfully expressing themselves is when the body does it for them. Again, crying, laughing, climaxing. Actually expressing yourself in language or choosing to be vulnerable rather than letting it build up in the body until it does it for you. It's just not happening. The title of this is The Lonely Caricatures, which is what I believe a lot of popular figures really are. I call them lonely because they're in an in-between state between reality and fiction, like a limbo state of perception. If Caesar could himself look at the statues and paintings of himself, would he actually see himself? Would he feel like it's an accurate representation of who he was, his essence? If he could see the endless depictions of him conquering Gaul, feeling disgusted by the Egyptians taking out Pompeii, reading Suetonius expose personal accounts and relationships he had, of me using him to drive home my point, of how deep a betrayal he felt watching his friends and fellow senators put the knife into him, dooming the Republic to the very thing they were trying to prevent. If Oppenheimer watched Oppenheimer, would he feel like it was an accurate representation of the forming of the Manhattan Project, of his personal life, of his interrogations by the US, and the regret at the hands of giving humanity the reins to their own extinction? If God looked at all artwork representing him, would he feel like it captures who he is, or his divinity? You get my point. In a lot of cases, I don't think they would even relate to the depictions of themselves that are actually meant to portray who they are. That dissonance, I think it would mirror the dissonance we would have if we could view ourselves from the perspective of others. If you saw the performance you put on for other people, would you feel like it accurately represents you? And if that answer is no, do you actually feel like you're alive? If your entire life is small talk, did you ever really say anything? If your entire life is an autopilot, do you even feel like you went for a drive? If your entire life feels like the physical embodiment of a shower argument, isolated within yourself to the person others see you as, do you even feel like you have an actual identity? It's really weird and meta, and I don't know whether I'm fumbling properly explaining my ideas, but seeing my brothers and sisters of my generation slowly feel so self-conscious that they can never actually be themselves, which is why they retreat into the same language, the same personality, just find someone else they can imitate or pretend to be. I believe there is the fear of being miscategorized, but there's also the opposite, the fear of being properly seen and perceived. If you're not comfortable with who you are, you wouldn't be comfortable with others seeing you. If you haven't yet accepted all parts of yourself, if you don't have an anchored sense of self-worth, then any honest assessment from others, good or bad, feels threatening as it feels defining, which is the opposite of what someone with this crippling self-awareness would ever want. That's why there's such a longing to be mysterious present in the Gen Z mindset. Yes, it's inherently an attractive trait because it builds intrigue. But the real advantage is that people can only speculate about who you truly are. It's a cultivated ambiguity. People approach with curiosity rather than assumption. It's safe, it's controlled, it's undefinable. The problem is though, mystery is a state, not a trait. It gets solved, and if you bank your likability on people not knowing you, what happens when people get to know you? What happens when that mystery is gone, and why do you have the need to be seen as a question mark? Why does everyone always have the need to be anyone but themselves? Bottom line is, a lot of people are approaching their own interpersonal relationships or self-image like a brand or a politician. It's divorced from the self. Rather than it being a form of lived propaganda like a politician that tries to increase their reach, the person with crippling self-awareness tries to control their reach for the fear of being meaningfully themselves and the baggage that comes with it. It's, I'm not who I want to be, so I will create a version of myself that can be loved. And again, going back to that Carl Jung quote, I think if you were loved in a created context, you would feel more alone. The self-awareness, instead of being liberating, becomes kind of a prison where one is constantly calculating the safest version of themselves to present. It's the ultimate version of the porcupine paradox. You find the exact distance where you can feel a sense of warmth without being hurt, but it doesn't help with the cold, or in this case, the loneliness, because you can never feel truly warm, or in this case, truly loved, because the context needed to be properly loved was never given, just a created context. This is where I go back to the Caesar excerpt. Caesar was not ashamed of himself. Caesar was ashamed of himself in comparison to who he could be, who he wanted to be, which was Alexander at the time. He didn't feel like enough looking at other people's achievements. But as opposed to that self-awareness being crippling, grand statues and his idea of who he wanted to be were a guide point to an ideal of greatness, a version of himself worth striving toward. He didn't let envy and inadequacy paralyze him or diminish himself, but used it to set a higher bar, a north star for his own potential. He used his envy as ambition, his disillusion with himself as fuel, which is what it should be. It should be a driving force, not a limiting reminder of what you will supposedly never be. And that's why the crippling self-awareness that Gen Z faces and its band-aid solutions feels so frustrating, because I think as opposed to other issues, this could actually lead to a better sense of who you are and a more understanding and confident self. That self-awareness of I'm not who I want to be should be the greatest motivator for change. The problem is that they're shying away from the potential of who they could be because the comfort of longing and dreaming is more comforting than the harsh but rewarding reality of failing and achieving. Bars. Literally, again. Instead of changing themselves, they change their expression, and it doesn't even work. By trying so hard to limit the view others have of you, you ironically become more defined by your insecurities than your positive attributes. This pervasive mentality that it's the smart move to just live in an impersonal way rather than being hurt. If someone were to ask me whether it is better to live for perception rather than myself, my definitive answer would be I feel like most people agree that materialism is sad, but it never really gets agreed upon why materialism is so sad. It's because the material had nothing to do with you, so it feels empty to be associated with it. Things that represent you that aren't you feel empty. They represent a false meaning, a boring meaning because they could apply to anyone else. People who gloat about their wealth or possessions or get off on making others envious of their possessions miss the point. They don't envy you, they envy what you own. The envy, like the items, is impersonal. Possessions are an empty vessel that can become someone else's, and in the end always do. People who hoard material wealth and use it as a symbol of who they are stubbornly playing a losing game. It's kind of like how in some families at the funeral and wake, it becomes like a greedy bidding war on the deceased items, rather than grieving the person they just lost. The material becomes more significant than the material legacy. The items begin mattering more than who had it, and they will very quickly become detached from the person who once owned them. It's such a boring means of expression and identity that it's even boring to analyze. We all know this, I just want to get to the next part of my script. But that idea of reducing your personal life into something that feels impersonal, sadly isn't just relegated to something deliberate or curated. Again, banal facts that are completely impersonal. School, work, often naturally become our end reductions because a lot of us aren't noteworthy in the grand scheme of things. And the kicker is, not only will people be remembered for their job, for the school they went to, so many people hate their school, hate their job, always living in a way that feels not only impersonal to them, but the complete opposite of what they want in life or what represents them. And because this is such a commonly faced problem, even the frustrations themselves about not feeling noteworthy or distinct aren't even really something unique or personable and feel almost generic.
You can't even have a uniqueness in the expression of your struggle for expression. And when they finally finish their shift at work or complete a class at school or college, they go drinking or partying or go online, where they act like everyone else for fear of being rejected. You see my point?
A good example with all of this is that a lot of truly smart people don't speak up because they're waiting for a bulletproof argument or thought process to form in their minds. And from this, they never actually say anything, because they're paralyzed at the thought of being misinterpreted or viewed even in a minor way of being unintelligent. Their need to be viewed as intelligent wastes away their intelligence, and you see this all the time with artists and creatives as well. Their need to make a masterpiece actually prevents them from making or releasing art. And again, it's not that they're necessarily ashamed of who they are, it's that they're ashamed in comparison to who they could be, and rather than it becoming fuel or motivation, it becomes a hindrance, it becomes crippling. It's this really sad, self-fulfilling despair about one's own abilities, and I think it's obliterating young people's spirits about creating stuff and more generally, meaningfully living. It's kind of like fantasizing about going to the gym because you want to see yourself with gains, but you're just terrified of being perceived as weak at the start, before the gains, even though the whole point of going there is to put on muscle and get stronger, to stop being perceived as weak, throwing away the potential for growth because of the slightest bit of uncomfortable beginnings. Every video and script I've made so far has been about things that are bigger than us. Things that are ultimately not our fault, but we still have to deal with them. Mortality, meaningless pain, the Reaper Leviathan. And in the brother video to this one, I said that the way in which corporations get away with hijacking young people's time and manipulating their neurochemistry is making them hate themselves for things that aren't their fault, making them blame themselves for things that simply aren't individualistic issues. This is an individualistic issue. It is everything about willpower. It's about recognizing the fault within oneself and the potential. It's about not letting that self-awareness be crippling but motivating. It's about defying the inner critic while listening to it. There's this really good Stan Lee quote where he says, if you have a good idea, don't be talked out of it.
If you have an idea that you genuinely think is good, don't let some idiot talk you out of it.
And if I was to add on to it, sometimes that person, the most limiting person, will be yourself. If you know something's good and you know you could do it, Please do it. Don't live or become the forgettable everyday tragedy that is the could have been. The wider downside to all of this is that there's probably thousands of Van Goghs and Da Vincis, incredible artists, incredible people, incredible innovators, and they're never going to actually believe in themselves enough to do anything. It's a modern day tragedy nobody ever really talks about. There's a million romances that didn't happen and aren't gonna happen. Someone's favorite album hasn't been made. Someone hasn't met their best friend, their best man, their partner for life. Songs that will never be sung. None of that happens because of the passive, easy choice to live passively. And that's why a lot of conversations feel hollow. That's why a lot of relationships nowadays are hollow. If you can never truly present yourself, you'll never feel like you have an authentic relationship because fundamentally, you don't. If you never feel like you're presenting yourself in the art you create, you're never going to feel like it's meaningful to you. And if you don't feel like it's meaningful to you, why the fuck would it be meaningful to anyone else? How much of our lives are lost in longing for a person to actually see the potential we aren't sure is within us, but are desperately hoping is? And how fucking tragic is it that so many people stay in that longing, never actually get to experience it? Love is seeing someone in all of their flaws and vulnerabilities and loving them anyways. It's seeing someone at their stupidest and seeing the genius within them. It's such a deep admiration that the flaws don't matter because you see the essence of who they are and see that they're good. And when you become this hollowed person who doesn't say anything or do anything, when you become closed off, you deny yourself the potential of being loved, which sounds harsh and dramatic, but it's true. Their need to be loved, to feel that warmth, but only at a safe distance, prevents them from actually being loved. Which doesn't just hurt you and doesn't have a loss of potential for yourself, but any good you could give to the world or other people gets lost as well. I think we romanticize desperation in culture because a lot of people are quietly desperate. And they are quietly longing for a version of themselves that is who they like to be. And when they see stories around people reaching their potential, it's gratifying. It's like nourishment for the fact that if they can do it, I can. And it's just like so many people are constantly searching for that. An inspirational story, an inspirational quote, just something for sake, can something make me feel motivated enough that I can do this thing, that I can be this thing. And the most salvacious thing I can give to that mindset is that when it comes from yourself, when you don't need external motivation, when you don't need a hype up song, when you don't need a speech because your inner monologue is practically a speech in of itself, when you don't need to see someone else's potential to see your own, that is the meaning of inner strength. Cultivating an inner monologue so compelling, so resolute that it becomes your own source of inspiration. And if you have no sense of self, you will have no sense of self-worth. Thus, you would judge yourself only on worth of achievement, winning, losing, gaining, regressing. But when you become your wins, you become your losses. As in, when you value yourself solely through achievement or victory, you allow defeat or falling short to crush you more than the actual reality of the loss because it feels defining, as much as you have defined yourself through victory. The general meaning is, if you value yourself only on outcomes, those outcomes rule you. True self-worth is knowing your potential regardless of what the outcome is. You gotta have the courage to do stand-up and bomb. You gotta have the courage to hit on someone and be completely rejected. You gotta have the courage to think something's incredible and then it drops and it completely fails. You have to make an hour-long video about propaganda and presenting yourself meaningfully. You have to know the risk of failure and not let it ruin the potential of happiness. It sounds so basic, but it's not at all. There's so many people who go through a bad experience in love and their attitude becomes, I'm never going to love again. And they just close themselves off to the potential of love due to trauma or risk analysis. Every good thing in life came from seeing to potential while knowing the risk. That's why I'm going drunk driving after this video. I'm a man of my word. Caesar was 25 years old when he cried over Alexander's achievements and felt like he was nothing next to him. So just remember, it's never too late to follow your dreams and become a military dictator. It's easy to say, what chance do I have? Seeing someone way more talented than you not succeed and then go, well, if they can't make it, what the fuck chance do I have? But the thing is, you do have a chance and I bet on you. And not just because of my gambling problem. I would rather be despised for who I am for the rest of my days than be loved for who I am not for 1 second, because I would rather be hated authentically than loved artificially. It's better to have a broken heart than having never loved at all. It is better to have lived and died than to have never lived at all. Living in a meaningful expression is accepting people will love you and you won't deserve it. People will hate you and you won't deserve it. It's accepting that. It's accepting that you will fundamentally be forgotten because any sense of legacy would be inherently a flawed attempt at capturing the magnitude of who you are. That's why trying to control context or remain relevant in the eyes of others has always seemed so pitiful to me. I could try throughout my life to create context and maybe come up with something that displays positive aspects. Please just remember, my music taste was immaculate, I cooked a mean spaghetti, and I was cracked at Halo. And while yes, all of those are true, they're just such a fraction of who I am. Any sentence I could give would be a fraction of who I am. There are parts of myself that I couldn't even describe. These videos, they're slivers of perspectives of who I am, what I thought at certain points in time. 17, 18, 19. Did I do this section to brag about having written all of these as a teenager? Yes, I did. Being an uncompromised version of yourself means letting others write their narratives about you in their heads. Being courageous enough to plainly say, this is who I am. Accept me and all my flaws and brilliances. Personally, I've long since stopped caring about legacy and the inability to communicate it, but what still bugs me, and what will probably always bug me still, is communicating about other people, writing their legacy, writing my feelings towards writing the magnitude of their lives in mine. All throughout my time writing, I felt pissed off that I could never truly communicate how much they meant to me, that words could never quite capture the magnitude of what someone means to me. But I began to realize the fact that language is clumsy and that we often miss the mark doesn't take away from the sincerity behind it. Instead, it becomes a part of the admiration itself. The fact that I have so many things inside myself that I'll never be intelligent enough to articulately describe became something kind of sacred. The most important parts of us, the things we feel the most deeply, are beyond words, and it makes the attempt to capture them all the more beautiful. Over time, I've learned to love that imperfection, failing but in a spectacular fashion in trying to capture how much I care about someone. I'll probably never communicate the depth of what someone I truly love means to me, but maybe the beauty lies in that in of itself that shows how extraordinary they are, so much so that they surpass the limits of language. Maybe it's the fact that when I write about you, I can't actually find the words that is, in a sense, a testament to your beauty.